We're now joined by Rich Logis. He is the founder of Leave MAGA movement. Now, he's a businessman. He has been supporting Donald Trump and the Republican Party for the longest time. His video about why he is supporting Kamala Harris was aired on the first day at the DNC convention in Chicago. And, it's very curious for somebody like, people who probably haven't really seen that before, where the Democrats brought in a lot of Republicans who are talking about voting for Kamala Harris. So, Rich, thank you so much for joining us. Um, First
My
things
pleasure.
first, you've been a volunteer on Trump's campaign in 2016 and 2020. You've worked for, you've sort of campaigned for Ron DeSantis. What made you change your mind, and specifically to the point where the DNC thought they want to invite you to talk about voting for Kamala Harris?
I appreciate you having me. Thank you. I always welcome the opportunity to tell this story. It's not really about me. It's about where I think what we need to do for the country moving forward. I had my entree into MAGA had been as someone who had never been a Democrat or a Republican before the 2016 election. And even though Mr. Trump had run as a Republican, I saw him as someone who was an actual outsider. I trusted that he seemed willing and able to really change the ways of Washington, obliterate the established political order. I thought that the two parties were the same. So I would say at the time that I was a relatively politically disillusioned American. And I thought that Mr. Trump did raise some valid points about outsourcing of jobs, hollowing out of communities, feelings that a lot of Americans did have, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, a feeling unseen, unheard, left behind. And I felt like that he was really messaging in particular for those individuals. So while I was not an immediate Trump supporter, it did take some time for me to conclude that I thought that he would be the best candidate to win the election against whom I was almost certain was going to be Hillary Clinton. And so in early 2016, I did get involved in the Trump campaign as a volunteer, did a lot of grassroots work, phone banking, helping people get registered. I even wrote a little bit of the call script for the Trump campaign. And the little contribution I made was about let's go make history and elect Mr. Trump. And then over the course of the next several years, it wasn't just that we won in 2016 and then I walked away and then just didn't really pay too much attention. It wasn't a hobby for me. The victory was really a validation. It was a vindication of having been on the right side. And I spent my years under Trump's presidency really as a MAGA pundit, as an activist. I was producing a podcast professionally. I was writing for a lot of right-wing news and opinion sites. I'd speak at Trump groups. I donated to Trump groups. I sponsored them. Anyone who would see any of my writings or read any of my works or hear or listen to any of my works would be quite clear to them that I was an unapologetic Trump supporter. Now, when the pandemic came upon us in 2020, at that point, our governor, Ron DeSantis, he'd been our governor for a few years. I knew that, and I volunteered as well for Ron DeSantis' campaign in 2018. I knew that Trump was mismanaging the pandemic as it was happening. But if one is in the MAGA community, and I emphasize the word community, you don't criticize Trump publicly, because if you do it, you're exiled out of that community. You're basically considered a MAGA apostate and heretic. So I knew that he was mismanaging. And I remember telling many of my fellow MAGA Americans here in Florida that while I did think we would win re-election, I knew that there was a chance that Joe Biden could win, because I knew there was going to be a massive mobilized turnout
Yeah,
against Trump. So when
yeah.
Biden won, I was not surprised. I was not actually surprised by that. I didn't think COVID was a bioweapon. I didn't think the COVID vaccine was going to kill anyone. And so if we go through 2020, we finish up the election, we get past January 6th, which I'll get to in a moment. I thought Ron DeSantis in the first year and a half did a relatively good job, all factors considered, on the pandemic. But in the summer of 21, we started to see children befall ill to
Mm-hmm.
COVID. We started to see them die. And Ron DeSantis, whom I thought had shown very sensible, drama-free leadership, a lot of maturity in the way that he approached managing the pandemic here, all of a sudden he started to change what he was saying publicly. He started talking about Fauciism and children wearing masks was child abuse. He even had someone at his one of his own press conferences get in front of the room and say that the COVID vaccine was changing people's RNA.
Yeah.
So when all of this happened, what it did is it created a lot of confusion. I didn't understand why that was happening. And because it created this confusion, it was really at that moment when my doubts commenced. And what I did at that point is I did something that I had not done at all while in the MAGA community. I started to look for information, news, opinion, other alternative views outside of the right-wing media echo chamber.
So would you say, Rich, like you were in the bubble? Like, we've heard about these, and again, I go back to 2016, 2020, QAnon movement, and there were bubbles. People were not wanting to listen to, because of, the term fake news media,
Right.
anything that wasn't MAGA related was termed as such. Were you part of that bubble? Like, you were writing op-eds and like you were attacking some of the Democratic candidates. Like, were you part of that whole MAGA movement where anything and everything would be discarded if it did not praise Trump?
As embarrassed as I am to say it, I was what you just said and much, much more. Because in MAGA, it wasn't just Democrats whom we viewed as enemy political combatants. It was anybody who opposed we in MAGA and Trump. So what I used to say is, in my various conversations I'd have, if someone was not 100% with us, they were 100% against us. Because there was no, we're with you 99%, but we disagree on 1%. That is not how we viewed this. It was as black and white as could be. And any information that even remotely challenged some of the pervasively held beliefs in the MAGA community was kept out and it was shunned. So in that time that I was in MAGA, between all of my op-eds and all of my podcasts, we didn't really talk a lot about democracy, and we didn't really talk a lot about democratic institutions, lowercase d. What we talked about was crushing and conquering our enemies, Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, whom we viewed as existential threats to ourselves, our families, our livelihoods, and our country. So I lived this way year after year. Forget about taking a day off. I never took an hour off from all of my MAGA activism because I did believe that we were in such a time. And mind you, we're on the winning side thinking this, because what happens in the MAGA community, and I feel like I really want to emphasize this point for those who are going to watch and see this. I am not defending my or anyone's ignorance, but I do think that it would behoove the country, and I would even argue the world, to recognize that all of us are susceptible to being influenced. I take full responsibility for my actions and my rhetoric. I permitted myself to fall prey to and succumb to a lot of the right-wing MAGA mythologies. And what those mythologies do when you're adhering to them, they keep you in these perpetual states of panic and hysteria, these feelings of desperation and despair, hopelessness, even a nihilism of being in some kind of life or death political battle. So imagine living that way as I did day after day, year after year. If one actually feels that and thinks that and approaches one's civic life that way, someone is going to support anyone or anything if one has gotten to that point. And that's how I felt day after day for many years.
Rich, and explain this to a lot of people who probably don't understand this bubble, right? I mean, um, and somebody who's obviously watched this over the years. I mean, there's this, as you call this hysteria. There's this, to some extent, this fear of unknown, right? I mean, to where like anybody and every could be is out there to get you. It could be a politician, it could be a businessman, it could be immigrants, it could be anybody, right? Why do you think that plays so well on minds of some Americans that they, after all this that we've seen, they still want Donald Trump to win another
Yes.
election?
So I think, in complementary to the point about we're all susceptible to being influenced and inculcated, most MAGA Americans deep down are good people. And if one who's opposed to Trump and supports Trump, if they were to actually have a conversation long enough, and that's what we're trying to foster with our Leaving MAGA movement, is that they would find, both individuals would find that there's actually some agreed upon goals. There are some shared values. There are also a lot of the same worries and concerns that we have every day. And what the MAGA mythologies do is they exploit and manipulate a lot of the fears and concerns and anxieties that most of us have. Virtually most Americans are going to worry about, for example, economic opportunity for the duration of our lives. We're going to worry about making sure our children or grandchildren have high quality education. We want to live in a safe and secure world, in a safe and secure nation. And we have a natural aversion in our Homo sapiens species to change, for example. That could be change in our own economic status, it could be change in demographics. And what MAGA does, and what I came to painfully realize with Donald Trump as the leader of this MAGA movement, is that this entire collection of these really traumatic mythologies, it gets people feeling like that if they're not gaining, it's because someone else is gaining at their expense. And I think that that is very important to emphasize in a nuanced way, because those who, for example, might have concerns about demographic changes, I don't think that that, as an example, necessarily means that someone is a racist person. But what it does is that if you grew up a certain way and you were around certain people, if you're of a certain age in the United States, virtually everyone you saw growing up who was in any position of power and influence was probably a white man. And over time that changed. And so because we have this natural aversion to change, what MAGA has done is has really inculcated people into believing that as another group gains economically, especially, then it must mean that they're doing it at their expense. And so really what it does is it does prey upon, as I allowed it to prey upon for me, it does prey upon the fact that for many Americans, we are going to have a lot of these concerns that are really prevalent as issues right now in our election. You know, we talk about costs of living, we talk about inflation, we talk about our standing in the world as the leader of democracy. And that's what MAGA really does. As it's not just a disservice. It's what MAGA mythologies really do to those in the community is it really does traumatize them into these beliefs that, when scrutinized, are not really supported by known facts. And it does skew reality for many of the individuals who are in that community. President Obama had said something at the convention where he said this idea of two Americas is a cliche. But what's not a cliche right now is that there are two realities. And that's where I try to really emphasize to others and implore those against Trump that when we look at MAGA Americans and we see a lot of what they say and what they think, a lot of what it is that they're saying is coming from a place of really, really deep fear. And that fear may also be part resentment, a lot of anxiety. And I think that empathy and education is really the only way, and I'm not saying it because it's my idea, but I don't see another way of trying to actually engage those individuals to not try to change their minds so much, but to start to get them to think a little bit about what happened to me, which is just to provide and produce just enough doubt for them to think about if maybe their beliefs, which are sincerely held, I have no doubt, but maybe they're lacking more information. Maybe they're a little too black and white, because I went through this process of having to really question and challenge what I believed. And it wasn't easy to do that because we just, as another part of our inherent in our species, we don't really want to admit when we're wrong.
Yeah.
And we don't want to acknowledge when we made a mistake. I went through an entire year process, what I call my year of heaven and hell. And I came to this point where I had this internecine political and personal war for a year where I would say, I don't know if I can support this anymore, and I can support Trump and MAGA, but no, I'm in this movement. I was there in the beginning. You know, I'm in the right place. Yes, we're going through a little bit of a volatile period right now. So I would vacillate back and forth. And then there were some, in addition to COVID with Ron DeSantis, with the vaccine, there was also January 6th, which I didn't support. But once I started to diversify my news and information sources, I started to realize that Trump actually was partly culpable for what happened on January 6th. And you mentioned just a moment ago about QAnon and the Proud Boys and these groups.
Yeah.
I knew of these groups. Okay. I knew of them. I'd been at events where Proud Boys were. I did not think that these groups had any influence whatsoever. I thought they basically were just, these were people who were just trafficking in the deepest bowels of the internet and the dark web. And they had They had no significant impact whatsoever. And then I came to realize, as part of the discovery that Trump, in fact, was culpable, that these groups had his blessing. And that was a shock to me because I had been completely ignorant about that.
Rich, you said you went through a year where you went through this process. Did you lose friends, family, when you were transitioning from being a MAGA Republican to what you are right now? I mean, I'll probably say an independent slash supporter of Kamala Harris, but did you lose friends, family over, well, first, when you went into the MAGA movement, and then when you came back from it, like, how was that transition?
So I did lose some contact with many in my life whom I had known for many years. They were very influential people in my life, mentors, those I knew from college, those I knew in my professional endeavors. And while it wasn't a case where I, for example, picked up the phone and said, "We can't talk anymore. I can't be friends with you anymore because you're a Democrat voter," that's not really what happened. We lost touch because I had a new second family, and it was my MAGA second family. And it's why I really stress, for those who are trying to figure out what goes on in MAGA, what is it about it that's so appealing? It is a community. There is a unity. We all want a communal existence. So I had this new family, and this new family, we would break bread. We would attend each other's holiday parties and birthday parties. And we were a very close, tight-knit community with the ones I knew here. And so, as much as I'm embarrassed to admit it, sometimes the MAGA second family actually took precedence over my blood family. And so when I lost contact with those I'd known for a long time, it didn't bother me because I had a new group of friends and confidants, people who respected me, they appreciated my work. I felt a lot of vindication and validation, which are all human yearnings and needs that we have. And so as I was going through this process of coming to this really painful conclusion that I had supported Trump and MAGA, and that I had defended too much of the indefensible, as I went through this period of time, a lot of it was, really most of it was an individual endeavor for me. It was a lot of late nights at my computer with my thoughts while my conscience was sounding alarm after alarm. Because in addition to DeSantis, in addition to January 6th, there were some other moments in that year time between the summer of 21 and 22 that happened. So related to January 6th, if you recall, back in February of 22, the Republican Party deemed the insurrection legitimate political discourse. And then 3 months later, there was the Uvalde, Texas school shooting. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Because there were two lines of demarcation that I came to. The first was that I had to know, I could not deny any longer that the Republican Party and Donald Trump deemed acceptable avoidable deaths and suffering. I'm not saying most Republicans and conservatives, but the party and Donald Trump, whether we're talking about COVID, or we're talking about the vaccine, or we're talking about January 6th, or we're talking about Uvalde, or any other mass shooting or gun-related violence and trauma that occurred in the United States. They made acceptable unnecessary deaths and suffering. There was another line, which was the defense and justification of right-wing, politically motivated violence, a coup that was, at least to some extent, orchestrated by the most powerful person in the world. So I came to these two lines, and I had to make a determination if I was going to remain in MAGA, which by extension of remaining meant that I said that it was okay that there were avoidable deaths and suffering, that I deemed it acceptable and appropriate for right-wing politically motivated violence, and I could not do it any longer. And I went through this phase where, from the summer of 21 to 22, on August 30th, 2022, which I call my leaving MAGAversary, August 30th, and we're right around that time now on the calendar, I wrote and published a mea culpa, in which I said on August 30th, 2022, that I was wrong to have supported Trump. I was wrong to have been someone who had considered myself a MAGA American, a true believer, my remorse for all that I had done for the last half decade. And the reason I did it publicly was because I was always very unapologetically public in my support for Trump and MAGA. And when I published it, I did not actually think that anybody would care. And I'm very happy to say I was very wrong about that, because I discovered almost instantaneously after that apology, I instantly I was receiving comments from individuals, and it wasn't just, "Hey, Rich, great job." I was receiving comments. Oh, my mother, my brother, my son, my best friend. Is there anything I can tell them to try to get them out of this MAGA rabbit hole? And I have received comments like that for years right now. And I had to determine what I was going to do after I left in that summer of 2022. I took the next year. I was liberated. I was emancipated from the manacles of MAGA, but I had to rediscover myself. I had to find again my political footing. And yes, it is true that as I walked away from my MAGA community, I did not retain relationships there. But conversely, I reached out to those whom I had lost touch with.
Now,
And I asked them to accept my apology for saying about them just some really abhorrent statements. And all of them did accept my apology. And in fact, one who was very important to me in college, he said, "Rich, I always knew you'd come back." That's what he
Rich,
told me.
it's a very interesting story, and I'm just captivated by some of the things that you've said. A lot of questions in my head, and I mean, so the first question is, are you intimidated if Trump wins? I mean, do you think he will come after those who, left his movement? I mean, we've heard about, Project 2025 and, retribution and injustice and whatnot. Do you think you would fear that he would probably, come after people that deserted him in this big election year?
I do fear that. And I don't think that fear is unwarranted. Donald Trump's reputation precedes him. He and his own surrogates have very clearly stated that a Trump presidency, in addition to completely transforming the way that our federal government operates and its relationship with all of our states, I think that the revenge would be exacted from those, not just from Trump, but I think many of his own officials he would try to appoint in his cabinet. In fact, I think that they would really be his capos, to use an organized crime term, where he would essentially assign them and delegate roles to them in which there would be pursuits of revenge against political opponents, anyone he believes had wronged him or slighted him in the past. And so I do think that many of the potential worst case scenario outcomes of a second Trump presidency are not hyperbolic. And one of those potential worst case scenario outcomes is retribution. And retribution under the weight of the federal government is going to be very, very difficult for someone to challenge and to push back against that. And there are other worst case scenario outcomes that I also believe are not potentially exaggeratory, including one which we saw from January 6th, which would be potentially an attempt to remain in power permanently. I know that in the year 2024, that sounds like something out of a Hollywood film. But again, we have the last many years of evidence that I don't think that saying that is something that is imaginary, and that I think it's actually quite possible and realistically would happen.
Because he recently said in a campaign stop or a rally that, if you vote for me this time around, you would not have to vote for a number of years again. I think he was talking about, or I think he was addressing Christians, if I remember correctly. I think that's what he said. Now, the other question I have for you is, why not try to change the Republican Party? Why leave it? Like, I mean, I know the party itself is MAGA right now. I mean, but there are other Republicans, and some of
Sure.
the commentators and some conservative voices out there that think that the party could be safe. Point in case, Nikki Haley, she ran a good campaign and she was trying to build this new kind of, or go back to the Reagan era of building this Republican Party. Because some would argue, that you're leaving this movement because you're not in good terms with the MAGA people or Trump people. B, there is an opportunity, right, within the Kamala Harris's camp or the Democrats. So I mean, I'm just trying to understand, why not stay within the Republican Party and try to change it versus pivot towards Kamala Harris and the Democrats?
I think it's a fair, valid question. In the year time that I took after leaving MAGA to try to reintegrate myself into our democracy and our civic life, I wrote an article about a year after I left MAGA in which I argued and made the case that the Republican Party could not be saved. As an organization, I do believe, and I know this a little bit from my time in business, I do think that there are some objective metrics that can be analyzed to determine whether an organization is irreparably damaged. And I think that the Republican Party is an irreparably damaged party. And the 2 points that I will make are ones that I made a few moments ago.
Mm-hmm.
Any party who has deemed acceptable avoidable deaths and suffering, and any party, in addition, that alone makes one irreversibly damaged. When you add to that, what again, my view, which is that the party itself has said that it is okay that their standard bearer, now their nominee again, and their president at one time, that what he did on January 6th was not a big deal. That it's been blown out of proportion by Democrats and anti-Trump Republicans and the press. That is not Republicans and conservatives. That is the actual entity, the party itself. Because the party has crossed their own lines of demarcation, I don't see a way to change the party from within right now. The way that a Republican Party can be in a new form, in a new iteration restored, is the party has to be in November what I call mercy killed. And the way that a party is mercy killed is democratically, lowercase d. And I don't want a Republican Party to be mercy killed so we have a one-party system. A one-party system long-term does not work. There is no evidence that it does work. So I don't want, I personally, the entrepreneur in me feels like I would like the opportunity, even if I didn't stay a Republican long-term, I would potentially welcome the chance to rebuild a Republican Party that can have, yes, impassioned, but also respectful and spirited debates about policy and about ideology and the future of the country. I had not been, as I'd mentioned earlier, a Republican before Trump. And I became a Republican under Trump to support the party and the candidates because he was. And then I wound up leaving the Republican Party. So what makes me a little different from other longtime Republicans is the long time. I was not a Republican for many, many years. And I changed my registration from Republican to what we call no party affiliation. But the reason that I decided to align with Republicans for Harris is because, yes, I did support the GOP under Trump. And I want, even though a two-party system is, yes, a flawed system, what we have right now are not two functional parties. Whatever one's disagreements with the Democratic Party, and I do have some disagreements, I don't believe the Democratic Party is dysfunctional. I don't think that they are a party who would ever nominate someone even remotely close to a Donald Trump. But the Republican Party, by its own actions, in my view, has shown that it cannot be saved.
And one last question, Rich, and thank you so much for doing this. One last question. What would you tell to those sitting on the fence, independent voters, in those swing states, Republicans, who probably do not want to vote for Donald Trump or voted for Nikki Haley and then weren't sure if, they would vote for Kamala Harris? What would you tell them right now at this moment? We're like 68, 70 days away from the election. So what would be your pitch to them?
I want to acknowledge to them that I very much relate to their feelings of disillusion and dissatisfaction and disenchantment. We are in a time now where our politics are exhausting and are rancorous. I don't think that it's enough to have just an anti-Trump message. I will make that case. Donald Trump has pitted complete strangers against each other. He has torn asunder communities, families, other relationships, places of worship. He has amplified conspiracy theories that come back again to the point I mentioned before about unnecessary deaths and suffering. To me, that's very clear. And those are some of the reasons why those who are not sure if they want to vote for Trump. That's really some of the reasons why, because the reasons they don't want to vote for Donald Trump oftentimes are due to character. And I respect that. Now, I also respect that they may have some policy differences with the vice president. And the pro-Harris-Walz case that I want to make is that I do think the vice president has made very, very clear, and it was affirmed at the convention speech, we are going to unite left, center, and right.
Mm-hmm.
I am unaware of any presidential campaign of a major party who has actually invited into the campaign to participate those who are not of the party, whether they're Republicans or any other party. To my knowledge, that is unprecedented. So I think that the actions that we are showing, where we are saying that it is okay to not agree on all ideas in the vision, but something that I do believe about most of those who aren't sure how they want to vote, I do believe that they support country over party. I don't think they're any less patriotic than anyone who has decided how they're going to vote right now. And one broad point that I would make to them, to try to put a bit of an epic component to the vision and the ideas of the Harris-Walz campaign. If we look at our history, progress has always been made in part because of unlikely but necessary alliances. When the history, or when the moment rather, in our history demanded it. And I think that this current epoch right now, I think is mandating that we need to find a way to not let policy differences and partisanship and political party ideology get in the way of the fact that we have to band together and make the case and unify left, center, and right. But it is incumbent upon us in the Harris-Walz campaign to make that case to those independents and to those Republicans. No politician is entitled, no candidate is entitled to anyone's votes. Voters feel like they have to have their votes earned, and I completely agree with that. So I have a degree of relatability because these feelings of disenchantment were my entree into MAGA. And so I want to respect that, but I also think that we will make the case that now is the time to join us in this unlikely but necessary alliance. If we recall from the vice president's acceptance speech, she mentioned unlikely a few times. And yes, it's okay to disagree if there are some differences of opinion, but those who don't want to vote for Trump don't want to do so because of character. And this election is going to be a referendum on character and trust. And for us to think about, whom do we want to lead America going forward, try to tackle all of these issues of, we mentioned earlier, cost of living, economic opportunity, education, safety, and security. Do we want someone who maybe we don't entirely agree with the policy ideas, but we know is someone we can trust? We know is someone who has said very clearly, I will represent all Americans. Mr. Trump, I had hopes that he would in fact be a unifying type figure. And then I realized that unity was not what MAGA was really about. I think that the vice president and Governor Walz have made very clear, not just in statements, but in actions, that we are looking to unify Americans of all differing beliefs.
All right, thank you so much for speaking with us. We are almost at time. We'll be in touch, and again, this is very interesting, getting to hear from a former MAGA Republican why they're supporting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in his election. Thank you so much for joining.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.